In the year 2007, a Mexican man by the name of Don Chan receives a knock at the door. He answers and is handed 2 cheap plastic boxes. He's then informed by the men at the door that he is finally being returned the remains of his dead son, killed some 40 years ago in what has become known to history as the Dirty War. He takes a look at the boxes and he simply asks, "Which one is my son?" This final melancholy insult was the last and most devastating blow for this man, who himself had been abducted and tortured during the Dirty War for the crime of being the father of a son who joined a rural guerrilla movement against the ruling Institutional Revolutionary Party in Mexico, also known as the PRI. Now, the Mexican Dirty War is notoriously tricky to define, but at its most basic level, it was a counter-insurgency by the Mexican government against leftist guerrilla movements, collaborators of those movements, and any civilian population suspected of collaborating with those movements. Most historians date this around the 1960s through the early 1980s. Thousands would die or be tortured in combat, and even more still would be disappeared by the government, gone without a trace. So in the grand scheme of warfare and even the grand scheme of something like the Cold War and all of the proxy wars that involved, this particular counterinsurgency might not seem like the biggest deal. But as more time passes and as people have more time to recover from the wounds of the Dirty War and come to grips with them, and as historians have more time to study it, there is a particular kind of terror and grief that comes from any guerrilla war, but especially this one. And you might argue it also comes from the nature of counterinsurgency and the psychological pain that resulted from what happened in the Mexican Dirty War as a result of the killings and the torture and the disappearances. That pain was intense. It's been said that bones talk. During the Dirty War and after it, families had to grapple with the legacy of death and the psychological torment that results when a loved one is disappeared. And when bones talk, chaos reigns in communities and families. Historian Alexander Avina says, quote, "The impact of the Dirty War, or rather the counterinsurgent terror exercised by the Mexican military against civilian populations, persists. Such terror inspired a chronic and degenerative fear that permeated public spaces and ripped communities apart and divided neighbors and families." End quote. Avina is now going to talk about one of these villages that was close to one of these guerrilla groups and was thus a target of the Mexican government during the Dirty War. The village is called Costa Grande, and the leftist guerrilla group is the PDLP. Avina says, quote, "While the majority of the Costa Grande's villages and towns supported the PDLP to varying degrees, they also housed military informers whose denunciations led to the detention of neighbors and even family members. Military officials coerced others to identify fellow community members as quote-unquote collaborators or to guide military units to suspected guerrilla camps under threat of death. Having the last name of Cabañas or Iturio almost certainly guaranteed arrest and disappearance. David Cabañas Gervasio, Luquio's half-brother, estimated that the army killed or disappeared more than 100 people with his last name. Cabañas' maternal relatives, the Barrientos, suffered the murder or disappearance of at least 18 people. End quote. Sadly, that story reminds you of other sinister time periods in world history, and as you can probably tell from that quote, it didn't take much to be disappeared. A bad last name, living in the wrong spot, the wrong conversation with the wrong person at the wrong time. The families of people who got disappeared often were rejected and shunned by their own extended or close relatives for fear that association with them would lead to suspicion. One activist said that, quote, "No one wanted to get near you, even your closest relatives," end quote. So as we start to see, it's not just about the numbers of deaths or disappearances, it's about the horror and the tragedy of those deaths and disappearances, but also how those things create ripple effects and change communities and alter family dynamics and alter historical memory in Mexico even to this day. But I think to really wrap our heads around the big themes and questions of the Dirty War, we need to look at Mexican history a little bit more broadly. And this is just an introductory episode to the series, and we're going to be breaking down a lot of this in more detail. But in Mexico, there is a long history of revolution, revolt, and violence that goes back a very long time. And often Mexican history isn't very well known because, honestly, it's not a huge priority in many school curriculums, unfortunately, although it may be soon enough. Historian Alexander Avina offers a quick crash course in why Mexican history is so interesting. He says, quote, "In Mexican history, rural revolts and revolutions tend to exhibit a distinct spectral quality. Despite tragic military defeats and the deaths of charismatic leaders, the repressed seemingly live on, waiting for revolutionary reenactment within subaltern memories and political registers. Entire corpuses of popular politics gained in moments of revolutionary insurrection become condensed into metonymic specters of radical figures. Popular revolutionary figures like Emiliano Zapata, Ricardo Flores Magón, Pancho Villa, Ruben Jaramillo, Genaro Vázquez, and Lucio Cabañas transform into ideals that persist and refuse to disappear. The ideals of direct action, popular justice, vengeance, solidarity, dignity, the possibility of a more just existence. Such ideals or utopias do more than simply survive in clandestine subterranean fashion. Sometimes they also inspire renewed attempts to storm heaven, even in times when the mere thought of revolution represents an impossible and anachronistic illusion," end quote. That's a bit of a complicated quote there, but what Avina is getting at, I think, is that some people believe that history is cyclical, and there might be some merit to that, but another interpretation is that history sets the table and provides the tools that people in the present can use to make change. So you have this history going back a very long time, a history that we're going to get into in the next episode. And this history is one of revolution and revolt. As Alexander Avina said, ideals of direct action, popular justice, vengeance. These are the tools that guerrilla activists during the Dirty War are going to use to try to get what they want. Oftentimes, these guerrillas are peasants in the countryside, although not always. You have urban people of different classes joining the movements, students supporting or at least being sympathetic at various times, with disastrous results for that particular group, as we're going to see here. But the two main issues that really spur the radical leftist guerrilla movements that kick off the Dirty War are land reform and local democracy. The guerrilla movements that start forming in Mexico, particularly during the 1960s, are fighting for these issues because they feel like they are being squeezed out of the economic, political, and social systems of a rapidly industrializing and increasingly capitalist country. Some of the desire to revolt against the government probably no doubt comes from the global context of the Cold War. Remember, this is a time period where the spread of communism is happening and revolutionary leaders are popping up all over the globe, and the fear of the spread of communism is encouraging proxy wars and counter-insurgencies all over the globe. But one of the things to remember is that just as peasants and guerrillas and insurgents can take hold of the ideas of direct action, popular justice, vengeance, the ruling governments and militaries can also take hold of those popular ideals that hold a special place in history and in collective memory. And that's exactly what the ruling government and military in Mexico would do during the Dirty War. Talking about the tactics that the PRI, the Mexican government, would use to get what they want, basically, historian Alexander Avina says, quote, "While the governing party reacted in a multitude of ways, usually preferring electoral fraud, targeted assassination, or the use of small concessions and the co-optation of protest leaders, broad and violent repression increasingly became a primary tool of political rule, particularly in the countryside. The 1960s would usher in an era in which Guerrero, a rural area in southwest Mexico, became a theater of state terror, popular political radicalization, and counter-insurgency." End quote. So as guerrilla movements are responding to situations that are resulting in them having an upswing, counterinsurgency from the government is going to increase, and we have the creation of a cycle between those two things, and the perfect scenario for authoritarian repression. Modernization, a changing economy, and the transfer of wealth from urban to rural would come at a cost for Mexico. Now, something to consider, and something that I think is important to remember, and this is going to become a theme of how we study the Dirty War here, is that it's very easy to get wrapped up in economic questions and political questions and ideologies and all of these types of things, but it's also important to remember that a lot of this is all deeply personal. The politics of emotion and the memories of vengeance play as big a role in the chaos of the Dirty War as anything else. Anger at the state, a desire for revenge, a chance to escape an unfair economic game or a patriarchal social system. Alexander Avina says, quote, "Revolutions and revolutionary politics are not only about the social, they are also deeply personal. Testimonial literature and recent studies on subaltern political agency evince the key role played by a politics of vengeance, dignity, and pleasure in contouring subaltern perception across a range of political movements and transforming political subjectivity. Present at this level of politics are the individual rage and indignation provoked by reiterated instances of state terror committed against family and community members, the profound transformation of self-understanding propelled by critical engagement with Marxist texts, the joy of joining the guerrillas to momentarily escape a rural patriarchal household, a sense of moral obligation to share revolutionary experiences from 1910 or the Spanish Civil War, and a desire to avenge family members disappeared by soldiers or political officers. Such personal politics would prove key to attracting popular support during the late 1960s. End quote. Okay, another big one there, and a lot of complicated words, but anyway, I think what he's saying there is something that we would do well to remember, I think, in the modern day, which is that sometimes people tend to associate things like policies and statistics and numbers and ideologies. They tend to associate that stuff with politics because a lot of that can be easily quantifiable. So that stuff gets associated with politics, and some of the less quantifiable stuff like emotions and history and concepts of justice and revenge aren't considered politics in the same way. So someone like Alexander Avina would say, in the same way that our daily actions are motivated by personal causes, it's more useful to think of history and politics as being made up of questions of emotion and memory and narrative, even though these things are not necessarily the most quantifiable statistical categories. And of course, as it happens, the Mexican Dirty War is the perfect event to study for this type of thing because it brings up many personal and important questions related to those ideas we talked about, but also just the study of history more generally. Questions of how to view revolts and revolutions and uprisings and wars. Questions like, to what extent is violence necessary to promote positive change? To what extent is peaceful protest effective? How are significant events in history remembered? How are tragedies and massacres in history remembered? How are massive events like the Mexican Revolution of 1910 forgotten and remembered over the course of generations? What is historical narrative and its connection to memory? To what extent is the legacy of certain events in history fluid, like memory, and shaped and changed over decades and centuries? How is the past reflected and shaped by the present? How does nationalism, vengeance, grievance, justice, and other ideals play into the politics of memory? Because in history, and in Mexican history especially, memories are hard to kill.